Well, welcome to the opening program of the 22nd year of the Chappaqua Library Foreign Policy Discussion Group. So I'm June Blanc, so I welcome you. This is our first in-person meeting in 2.5 years. So it's delightful to look out and see people, I think, rather than little boxes where we've all been participating. So we're looking forward to robust discussion, because I think that's the thing that when we're in person we really get. But we also have a number of people online, so we don't want to forget them. We have both Kendall on Hudson and also the club at Briarcliff, who are also joining us on their big TVs. So it's really delightful to have that group, as well as our followers who've been participating with us for these so many years. We want to thank the town of Newcastle. We are sitting in their assembly room, and also the Chappaqua Library, who is our host. And so we're really very lucky that we have both a host and also a town that supports our being here as well. Let me see. And also Joan Kuhn, who you met, who is our she provides our guidance, our backup, and makes sure that everything works as well. So since 2001, for those of you who haven't been following us that long, we've done 330 in-person programs plus. And we're very popular with the most popular program that the library does. And we've got really good, as you heard, programs that we're competing against. But I think foreign policy is something that touches all of us. And as you know, we've worked very hard to have very, very excellent speakers who are renowned in their field, very knowledgeable, and can keep us up on sort of the current events, as well as put a good historical perspective on things that have been happening. So I said this was our first. We are still going to be going back and forth between Zoom and in person. It would be wonderful to be in person, but we found during the Zoom period that one of the advantages was that we could get people from across the country, sometimes even outside of the United States. We are very lucky that it turned out that Ken Roth was in New York and was able to come as our first speaker, and we sort of said, gee, would you be willing to come out to Chappaqua and just be here with us and just kind of excite us to have a real person who we can really talk to. So he's ready to be quizzed. So after he makes this presentation, I want all of you to ask good questions. So as our usual format, I will be turning the program over to Naomi Marrow on my other side, who will be our host and introduce Ken. And then Ken will give his presentation, and then we'll do a Q&A. So the first questions we'll just throw at our own committee. But then after that, we hope that you will ask questions. For those of you who are remote to us, I have the Q&A open, and I hope you will also ask us questions, which Ken is sitting next to me, so he could actually see them, but I will be making sure that he does see them. So anyway, without further ado, I do want to turn this over to Naomi.
June, people will use the chat box?
They'll use Q&A.
Oh, okay, they'll see Q&A on their screen. Hi, everyone. Welcome. And again to Kendall and the club, we're glad you're joining us as well. We are so honored this morning to have Kenneth Roth, who spent 3 decades at Human Rights Watch, and he is an inveterate advocate and an enormously successful and effective leader. He brought Human Rights Watch from a small organization of about 70 people to 552 specialists across the entire human rights field, and a now $100 million budget, and they need every penny given what's going on in the world. So, in addition to his work leading Human Rights Watch, he is an author in his spare time of articles in very, very highly honored, recognized journals. He's writing a book now. Some of what he accomplished while he was at Human Rights Watch is that the organization and a collaborating organization won the 1997 Nobel Peace Prize for their work creating the International Criminal Court, banning landmines, well, for a while, but that was good, and banning child soldiers and cluster bombs, which unfortunately are coming back. But the world recognized the work they are doing. He and his organization also brought a number of human rights criminals to account. Let me name some, you'll have to correct my pronunciation. Although I've got Liberia's Charles Taylor, Peru's Alberto Fujimori, the wartime Bosnian Serb leaders Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic. Okay, practice helps. And they worked to curtail human rights abuses in Ukraine, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Syria, and Yemen. As has been said in articles about him, these criminals and others worry when he or his team show up. They are persistent in recognizing, investigating, documenting, and then taking action to improve the human rights situations in countries where they are at risk. And unfortunately today there are still too many of them. Now he has just begun at Princeton in the School of Public and International Affairs for 23-24 as a visiting professor to a named chair and a visiting lecturer. So I will turn it over now to you. Go.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and to be here, I guess, is the first in-person capacity for a long time. So it's nice to see you, those who are in the room, and the many who are online as well. So I'm looking forward to our conversation. So I'm not going to talk very long, but what I thought I would do is open up with something actually that someone just mentioned to me a few moments ago, but is very much in people's minds, and that is, these days the global contest between autocracy and democracy. And Biden is talking about this all the time these days. I mean, it's a big preoccupation. There is kind of a common wisdom out there that the autocrats are winning. The autocrats are ascendant, that democracy is in decline. And I actually want to take a contrarian view, because if you look at it, and I'm going to run through why I feel this way, but if you look at it, the autocrats are in trouble these days. It's a hostile environment. They're performing poorly, and they are increasingly desperate and using extreme measures to try to stay in power. Now, as you'll hear, that's not reasons for complacency, but it does, I think, help to counteract this view of inevitability that autocrats are somehow going to sort of replace the democracies of the world. It's a struggle, it's a battle, but it's a battle that is winnable in my view. So let me begin with the problem that the autocrats epitomize and in a sense face as well. And that is, autocrats sort of by their nature don't want free debate. They stifle independent media, civil society organizations, critics, dissidents, human rights groups, and they want to be surrounded by sycophants. That's what autocrats typically do. But when you don't have the benefit of free debate and the free flow of information, you tend to make bad decisions. Being surrounded by yes men is not a way to govern well. And we've seen some incredibly high-profile illustrations of that in recent years through the two most visible autocrats, Putin and Xi Jinping. So we all know what happened with Putin. During his COVID-induced isolation, you remember those pictures of him at the end of the long table. So nobody was getting close to him, and he, in this fantasy world that he concocted, watching Russian censored media with all of its propaganda, he, persuaded himself that this would be a good moment to rebuild the Soviet Union, to reestablish the Russian Empire, that Ukraine isn't a real country, that in any event, an invasion of Ukraine would just topple in a matter of days. And so, he invaded Ukraine and thought it would be a piece of cake. Now, we all know it hasn't turned out that way. And he now is desperately trying to cling to power and salvage some feigned victory out of this disastrous defeat. So that that's just a very high profile example. But if you also look at Xi Jinping, and in China, China often touts itself as a model. The China model is marketed to dictators around the world. This is how you can improve economically. You don't need democracy. But if you look at some of the recent decisions of Xi Jinping, beyond covering up the origins of COVID-19 in Wuhan and still blocking any independent investigation there, he instituted the zero COVID policy, which put the country through endless draconian lockdowns, really set back the economy. When finally protests broke out, even in China, which doesn't usually allow protests, he quickly reversed course, but he reversed course with zero preparation. And so, he hadn't invested in the hospitals and the intensive care units that would be necessary. He didn't even allow in RNMA vaccines, the Western vaccines, because, that was Western and that would be sort of somehow an affront to Chinese superiority. He didn't invest in even vaccinating older people. And he just assumed that his zero COVID would work, so you didn't need all these other things. And so this zero preparation reverse meant there was a huge death rate. The estimates now are around 1.5 to 2 million people, even though the government says it's only 80,000 or something. But that's really just one example of how Xi Jinping, in his isolation, not allowing dissent, has been governing poorly. If you look at the economy, his prioritization on political control means that he's attacking the most vibrant sectors of the economy, the tech sector, because they were getting too powerful, and he didn't want powerful people around. He wanted to be in control. Today there's this view that as the economy stagnates, as its growth rate diminishes, that there's a desperate need for more consumer spending. But Xi Jinping doesn't trust consumer spending. He thinks it's wasteful. He prefers government-directed investment, even though they've kind of run out of things to invest in. They're now building, vast cities of apartment buildings that are not needed. They're building bullet trains to nowhere. They're building empty airports. The return on these investments is modest, if anything, at this stage. And so he's sort of stuck. He's in a debt trap. So this, govern without any debate approach is not working very well. And if you look beyond even these, two very visible examples, you take people like the Rajapaksa brothers in Sri Lanka or Sisi in Egypt, each of whom pursued, huge vanity projects at the expense of the economy, leading their economy to ruin. Sri Lanka disastrously so, Egypt, on the way down, or somebody like Erdogan in Turkey, who, was, I think, the only person in recent history who thought that you respond to inflation by lowering interest rates, because he thought that was, would be good for his his electoral prospects. Or he kept giving building code violation amnesties as a popular thing to do before an election, except, the building code is there to prevent buildings collapsing, as occurred in many, many places during the earthquake this past winter. So, this is the kind of stuff you get when autocrats don't allow debate and they operate in this vacuum of information. So it's not as if democracies don't make mistakes, obviously, but at least democracies have the capacity to self-correct. They have debate. You can put pressure on the leader to do it differently if you feel that he's pursuing a misguided approach. Now, given this poor performance of autocrats, they have always been reluctant to just, go to the polls and allow a free and fair election. Instead, what they've tended to do is resort to managed elections. That was the old approach. And so a managed election is one where you control the media, you silence political parties, you disqualify a few candidates, you tilt the playing field enough so you're pretty much assured of victory. And that was the classic route that autocrats took for many years. It has stopped being reliable. Every once in a while, you do get an autocrat who can still prevail through managed elections. That's what Erdogan just did in Turkey. That's what Orban does in Hungary. But if you look around the world, most autocrats these days won't even risk a managed election. They're governing so poorly that they resorted to basically zombie elections. That is to say, it has no pretense of legitimacy. If you look at Hun Sen, for example, in Cambodia, who just arrested or disqualified every single opposition candidate. He won the election and then just named his son as the next prime minister. Trying to create a dynasty. Museveni in Uganda would actually shoot people at the rallies of his very charismatic opposition candidate. You get people like Ortega in Nicaragua, Lukashenko in Belarus, Putin in Russia, who essentially locked up every competitor. So there was no choice, and of course in that election they won. Or just very recently the Thai junta, which had been operating through a supposedly civilian prime minister as a front, but they allowed an election. They lost overwhelmingly, but through their constitution they maintained control of the Senate, and so they were able to block the person who won the election from taking power, and they kind of cut a deal with an old leader instead to take over. So these zombie elections, nobody looks at them as credible. They don't really confer any of the legitimacy that a managed election was designed to provide. They're just a charade. But when you have this charade, you can't sort of say, well, I'm the elected leader because the people chose me. And instead you increasingly have to resort to to force. And that you can cling to power for some time, but you're doing it just as a dictator. You're doing it by the barrel of a gun. You're not doing it by saying the people chose me. And that's where the Iranian clerics are today. So they crushed the big protests after Mahsa Amini, that young woman died in religious police custody. Huge protests around the nation, not just about her death, but about getting rid of the clerical regime. They shot people, they detained people, they're still in power, but they are hugely unpopular. They're just ruling by force. Or if you look at the Chinese Communist Party in Hong Kong, hundreds of thousands of people took to the street to say they didn't want the dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party ruling in Hong Kong. They crushed that, they passed a law that enabled them to imprison everybody. So they're in charge still, but nobody pretends that they are wanted by the Hong Kong people. And now you can, cling to power for a long time, but obviously ruling by the barrel of a gun is a risky proposition because the people are always looking for some way to oust you. And you're always kind of looking about who's behind your back. Now, one tool that the human rights movement has used to try to address these autocratic tendencies has been the UN system, in particular the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. And you can say, what is the UN? But in fact, governments go to extraordinary lengths to avoid stigmatization by these United Nations bodies, because it not only have they been kind of repudiated by their people, but it's a way of the international community saying, we don't take you as a leader that is serving your people. We just take you as a tyrant. Now, different autocrats have different methods of addressing this. Putin, for example, he tries to, first of all, he's kind of notorious for whataboutism. If you ever watch RT, what used to be Russia Today, the kind of propaganda station that Russia uses to disseminate his views around the world, it's all about, bad things that happen elsewhere in the world. And sort of the view is like, why are you picking on us? There are lots of bad things, pick on other people. Putin also just tries to undermine facts. It's kind of a nihilistic policy. Just, it's as if he says, we never really know what's happening. The Ukrainians are killing their own people. They're bombing themselves. And most people just, laugh at that. But if you are, disinclined to criticize Putin, if you want to be kind of anti-Western imperialism, as some people prioritize, this is, it gives you kind of a hook to ignore Putin's atrocities. So he's, these are his tools. They're not super effective, but that's what he does to try to defend himself. Xi Jinping is more sophisticated in this regard. He is, first of all, they just put out a global governance strategy, the Chinese. And there they say, we uphold human rights. And you have to sort of do this double take, you do. But then you start looking at what it means. And Xi Jinping basically wants to reduce human rights to the growth of the economy. So GDP per capita is going up, therefore we're respecting human rights. People are happier, whatever that means, who's measuring that, we're respecting human rights. So, this is obviously rejecting concepts of civil and political rights. So, freedom of the press, freedom of association, due process, those are out the door. But it's even rejecting things like economic and social rights, which require looking at, is the government using available resources to improve the lives of the worst off segments of society? He doesn't want you asking those questions because you'd have to start asking about the Uyghurs, 1 million of whom have been detained to get them to eradicate their religion, their culture, and their language. Or you'd have to ask about the Tibetans, or you'd have to ask about, rural Han Chinese who are just, kind of neglected in the hinterland. So he doesn't want any of that analysis. He just wants you to say, the economy is growing, therefore we respect human rights. To top it off, he tries to oppose the idea of pressure. When you listen to Chinese diplomats, they talk about win-win cooperation. We're just going to sit down and cooperate with each other and talk about how each is choosing our own path to respect human rights. We have a civilizational approach in China where our civilization favors, the dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party. Who defines what that civilization is? Well, obviously, the Communist Party, not the people of China who don't get to vote on anything. So, that's his ideological approach. And then he twists arms. The so-called Belt and Road Initiative is basically, it's billed as a $1 trillion infrastructure development program. But in fact, it's a huge bribery scheme. There's no transparency. So it really encourages government officials to pocket a percentage of it. The lack of transparency means many of the economic projects are not viable. And so countries find themselves in these debt traps that the Chinese government doesn't want to forgive the debt. But this is a very good way of building alliances, because if you owe a lot of money to China, you're not going to vote against China in the United Nations. And indeed, Xi Jinping, when there's a vote involving China, he actually picks up the phone and calls leaders. This is how much it matters to him. He tries to avoid a negative vote. Now, Russia's approach hasn't worked very well. The UN General Assembly has multiple times now condemned different aspects of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The UN Human Rights Council has established a commission of inquiry to look at the war crimes in Ukraine. It also, for the first time, for a permanent member of the UN Security Council, has established a so-called special rapporteur, an independent investigator to look at human rights abuses within Russia. That's very unusual. The International Criminal Court has obviously charged Putin and his Children's Rights Commissioner with abducting Ukrainian children, and there clearly will be many more charges to come. So he hasn't fared very well. China's a different matter. We, this past October, so just about a year ago, after the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights had issued a devastating report on what's happening in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims, we thought, okay, we have sort of this official confirmation of what Human Rights Watch and others have been saying about Xinjiang. Let's try to get the Human Rights Council to debate her report. And we kind of threw the dice, and we lost by 2 votes. We lost 19-17 in the Human Rights Council. So China was able to avoid this debate, but that was a very, very close vote. And the backdrop to the vote is that we have been over the years gradually getting governments to sign joint statements condemning what's happening in Xinjiang. And we've gone from initially 23 or 25 governments to now we're at 50. So the trend is very much on our side. And more governments are seeing that, this is horrible. These are crimes against humanity that Xi Jinping is visiting upon the people of Xinjiang. So I think that the movement is in our direction. China's been losing various procedural votes here and there, so they clearly are not infallible when it comes to the UN system. And they're desperate to avoid that condemnation because this would really be a cut at their legitimacy. They obviously already can't point to an election at home, but the fact that Xi Jinping is accepted as a legitimate leader who looks after his people, the so-called China model, this is a big part of his way to portray himself to his people as serving them. And that is suddenly in jeopardy. And I think, it's entirely feasible that they will lose one of these votes sometime soon. Now, I should say that, despite China's success so far in fending off condemnation, we have been able to use the UN Human Rights Council to condemn a whole range of autocrats elsewhere. So whether it's, Myanmar, Syria, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Iran, Venezuela, we repeatedly get the UN Human Rights Council to condemn what's happening, to set up investigative mechanisms, to collect evidence for prosecution. So this is a tool that works very well, so far other than certain very powerful governments like China. So, this is the world out there. You've got, autocrats who, because they refuse dissent, are making bad decisions very visibly. You've got them increasingly unable to rely on electoral shenanigans to stay in power. You've got a world that is increasingly seeing through what they're doing and, willing to condemn them. And you've got popular protests in country after country. You can just go around the world and see, where have people stood up for democracy and opposed autocracy? Well, Hong Kong, Thailand, Iran, Russia, Belarus, Uganda, Sudan, Nicaragua, Cuba. Almost any place you look where there's an autocratic government, people have taken to the streets. It often doesn't last because they get arrested, they get shot. But it's very clear where the popular sentiment lies in these countries, which is why, I think it's a very scary time to be an autocrat. Now, I don't want to end there because I don't want to leave you complacent. And I say that because democracy also has its troubles today. I'm not going to expand on them as much, but as you, look around among the leading democracies, there is a surprising willingness among people within those democracies to close their eyes, to say, we don't want this anymore. And part of that is the hypocrisy of democratic leaders. If you look at their foreign policy, I'll start there because it's a foreign policy group. We on this big, global contest between autocracy and democracy, Biden's approach these days is to make allies with autocrats to fight for democracy, which obviously doesn't work. Then you just look like a total blatant hypocrite. And why do I say this? Well, in the last couple of weeks, we've had incredibly vivid examples. Biden flies to Vietnam, complete dictatorship, tons of political prisoners, and builds this kind of new, closer relationship because Vietnam is a potential ally against China. The United States just signed a new security pact with Bahrain. Bahrain had its Arab Spring a decade ago and locked up all these Shia leaders who are still in prison. That didn't stop Biden from cozying up against Bahrain, potential ally against Russia. Just a couple days ago, Biden canceled the human rights conditions on U.S. military aid and authorized $235 million of military aid to Egypt. even though Egypt has tens of thousands of political prisoners. This is Biden's policy, and it's sort of like anything goes to build an alliance against China and Russia. But that, of course, reduces the contest with China and Russia to just a geopolitical struggle. It loses the moral high ground. It's no longer about democracy. So, when you have the leader of the leading democracy forsaking democratic values so visibly in his foreign policy, that doesn't help. The European Union is not a lot better. Their top priority these days is stopping migration to Europe. And so you see the European Union, cutting these deals with, Erdogan in Turkey, with Sisi in Egypt, most recently with Kais Saied, the new Tunisian dictator. We'll give you several hundred million euros, maybe a billion. You just stop migrants coming to the European Union. So again, it's democratic values, human rights are kind of out the window in the name of these other concerns. Now, it's not just foreign policy, it's really also domestic policy. And I think that it's domestic policy that in fact is the biggest driver of discontent with democracy. And the reason I say that is because, even though I do very much believe that democracy is the better system of government because it can self-correct, because people can input into government decisions, it's not delivering as it's supposed to be doing. There are too many people who feel left behind, who feel that a certain elite is running their government, but they are not answering to their concerns. These people don't feel respected by government. They don't feel listened to. They feel ignored. And these left behinds have proven to be fertile ground for the demagogues, for the people who really would forsake at least democratic values. And so, you see these people distrusting elections. Trump won the last election. You see people who are, undermining the checks and balances on executive power. That's what Netanyahu is doing right now in Israel. That's what Bolsonaro was trying to do in Brazil. That's, actually, I think a significant part of Trump's agenda. He didn't get that far. But, efforts to silence the media. So this, democracy is not just about elections. Democracy is about checks and balances, an independent judiciary, independent media, independent political parties, independent civic groups. You also see a lot of these autocrats making sort of exclusionary anti-rights appeals as a way of rallying their conservative base. And the particular target of these appeals varies from autocrat to autocrat, but there's a certain commonality. Very often it's migrants. Very often it's LGBT people. And you just demonize the people, say they don't deserve rights. And that, is seen as a way of rallying a base. It's seen as electorally profitable among a certain segment of society. So what do we do about this democracy deficit? Now, one answer is sort of, moral or rhetorical, which is to say, what human rights are really about is what you might call a Kantian point of view. That is to say, you respect the human rights even of people who might be different from you because you want to be treated the way other people are treated. And that kind of reciprocity is, a key moral foundation for human rights. Or to put it in more pragmatic terms, if those people's rights can be violated now, your rights can be violated tomorrow. So the only way to protect your rights is to start at the beginning and to, avoid this temptation to violate anybody's rights. So those are, kind of the moral, practical bases of human rights. But what the far right is doing these days, the autocrats are doing, is they have begun to sort of carve people out of the community. So, rights are something that everybody within the national community is supposed to have. But if you say, oh, well, those people, they're not part of the community, it's a way of kind of justifying denying them rights in a way that you think is going to preserve yours. It's a way to say, well, I'm always going to be part of the majority if we define the community this way, and so I'm not really worried about rights. You can mistreat those people over there. And that is kind of the essence of the right-wing attack on rights. And the answer to that, which is not a simple thing to do, is to reinforce a broader sense of community, to sort of fight against these exclusionary appeals. And I say this because it's not typically part of what we think of the human rights agenda. We think about, oh, there's a violation, somebody's offending your rights, we're going to try to reverse that particular act of misconduct. But I think we need something more fundamental as well, which is we need to reaffirm a broader sense of community and treat everybody in our nation, or more globally if you think about it, as people who are part of the community who are deserving of rights. And that requires moral leadership. It requires standing up against these exclusionary appeals, which you see sometimes, but you don't see as often as I think is required. It also, frankly, is going to require better performance, delivering to the people who are left behind, recognizing that it's not enough that our coastal regions or our cities are doing well. There are whole parts of the country that are not doing well. And, that is, in a sense, part of Biden's infrastructure program now, but it has to be kind of a real focus of government to ensure that there are not broad swaths of the nation that feel that they're not being served by government, because that is the fertile ground for the autocratic attack on democracy. And then, finally, this is a bit of an intentional thing, but I'll stop on this, is that I think we have to recognize the importance of respect. And, there's sometimes a tendency to simply demonize those who vote for Trump or who kind of buy into the far-right ideology as being, ignorant, or, Hillary Clinton's term, the deplorables, or, and this is a mistake. I think part of Trump's brilliance is that, for all of his faults, for all of his utter failure to govern in a way that serves anybody but himself, he nonetheless does listen to people and has a capacity to make people feel heard and to reflect back what their concerns are. That's a certain respect that I think have to give him credit for, and that's part of his success as a politician. And I think we need to ensure that even people these days who are kind of voting in an anti-rights direction, that they deserve the respect of having their concerns heard, feeling that government answers to them, and try to address the factors that are making them feel, often justifiably, that they're left behind. So, yes, the autocrats are in trouble. Yes, our fight against them is winnable, but we also have to do some tending for our own democracy. And I will stop with those thoughts. Welcome your questions.
Thank you. A question.
Yes.
You use the term zombie democracy, and in this country, and we are nonpartisan, let me put that on the table. The far right wants to undermine the acceptability of the 2020 election. Does that, in the minds of people abroad, make us a zombie democracy?
No, I mean, when I use the term zombie democracy, which is something I just kind of made up, what I'm referring to really is, an electoral charade where there just is no choice. So there are no opposition candidates, opposition political parties are quashed, independent media really can't comment, activism is prohibited, demonstrations are not allowed. So, in this situation where there's really no choice, but they hold an electoral event because they think that it's going to legitimize their rule, that's a zombie democracy. Now, the US, or for that matter, Brazil, here you had leaders who did try to stay in power despite the choice of their people. And it speaks to the vibrancy of the democratic institutions in both countries that they failed. That the courts functioned as they should, the media functioned as it should, there was lots of opposition. So it actually was the opposite of a zombie election. It was a vigorous election, and the winner won, and the effort to steal it was broadly rejected. So I don't pretend that the US was a zombie democracy, but this idea of zombie elections is a trend out there that autocrats are using.
And challenging the truth,
Oh, of course, yes.
irrespective of facts. Okay, other questions? Our panel, the audience?
So let me ask a question. There were, I guess, at various points, we've said that democracy is on the rise. And right now, democracies are in the decline. So why is it that we're now at this point where democracies are in the decline?
Well, I think when people say democracies are in decline, what they mean is like over the last 10 years or so. If you look at Freedom House, which kind of does these measurements, the number of governments classified as fully free is diminishing. I think that that's factually true. And that's where the common wisdom comes from, that autocrats are ascendant, democracies in decline. But in fact, that's what I kind of where I opened up. If you look behind that a little bit, even though the autocrats may have kind of gotten in power, they're now in trouble. They're governing poorly. They're hanging on through increasingly through pure repression rather than any semblance of popular choice. And so I do feel that we're at a turning point, or potential turning point, if democracies can live in a more principled and effective way.
Tyler?
Yes, hi. I guess this is not operative, or maybe it is.
I think it's on.
Okay. Your comments about the compromises that we in the U.S. seem to be making in terms of bad actors abroad, the trip to Vietnam, the concessions to Al-Sisi, Bahrain, and so forth, are well put. But isn't it ultimately a matter of the prioritization of what your ultimate objectives are? And unfortunately, at the moment, I think we find ourselves in a position where were the Chinese to continue to grow militarily, even though from an operative standpoint they've got problems, to dominate the Pacific, for example, and perhaps invade Taiwan, and perhaps possibly cause an international conflagration. And if the Russians were to prevail in Ukraine and go and do more bad things, you start thinking about existential threats. You don't want either of those two scenarios to develop. So you have to prioritize how you're approaching the overall subject, and you make compromises. And that's a pickle that we're in. You pointed it out, but I wonder how you ultimately resolve that.
Yeah. No, I think that is the rationale that Biden would use.
Yeah, sure.
And there's no question that Russia has invaded Ukraine, and so China is very much threatening Taiwan. I think it comes back to what is the best, most effective way to fight back, and put it one way, is Ukraine just about the territorial integrity of a nation, or is Ukraine about an aspiring democracy that is being quashed by autocratic Putin because he can't stand the idea of having an effective Slavic democracy on his on his borders? And I think it's both. But if it is both, yes, you obviously need the military response, and Biden has been masterful at keeping NATO together and keeping the arms flowing to the Ukrainians and all. But if that's all it is, a lot of the world then just, this is just a kind of a geopolitical struggle between Russia and the United States, we're not going to get involved. And so, many countries are just neutral.
Sure.
And I think the best way to bring them in is to reaffirm the values that are at stake. Which means, saying that this is about democracy. But you can't say it's about democracy if you're cutting deals with Bahrain. So I just feel that, Biden has lost the moral high ground through his actions recently. And that I understand the rationale, but I think he's fighting the war too narrowly. And that, he's underestimating the substantial degree of much of the global south that still is distrustful of the United States, feels that, that it's all about imperialism, and that why should it take sides? And that's why you get countries that are, kind of still dealing with Putin,
Sure. Yep.
And I think he loses the ability to attract those swing votes globally by forsaking the democratic values that are a big part of this struggle. And so, similarly with Taiwan and China, since that's the big difference between those two.
Yep. You're right. The question is, how does it resolve itself? We don't know. So
Yeah, I mean, did he, with Egypt, last year, they conditioned more aid. Why did he have to give up on the conditioning of aid this year? There was no good reason, Bahrain, where are they gonna go? I mean, is China gonna defend Bahrain from Iran? Is Russia, with all of its problems in Ukraine, I think he's going overboard. Vietnam already has its concerns about the South China Sea. It's got its, hey, it fought a border war with China 30 years ago. I mean, it's, these are countries that have their own reasons to stay close to the United States. Biden wanted to ratchet it up a bit, but by ratcheting it up, while utterly ignoring their repression, he undermined this ability to claim that he was upholding democratic values.
Yep.
Connecticut College, you had a question.
Yeah, I have two actually, but
I gave her the mic.
Okay.
I think I can project.
No, you need it for the online.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
okay, yes, I forgot. Would you still consider China a communist country? I mean, in the definition of a communist country as of today?
I mean, not in the classic sense, because it's, obviously there's lots of private enterprise, and if a communist country is, is government ownership of all the means of production, then no. But I mean, it's the Chinese Communist Party.
Right.
So, that party is in charge. In the classic sense, it's not communism, but I mean, in the sense, who cares? It's the dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party that is running things.
Right. And I just wanted to make a comment, or I don't know if this can be considered an analogy, you would be able to tell me if I'm incorrect, but sometimes I know we're walking a fine line in trying to preserve democracy and maybe just trying to put our thumb in the eye of China or Russia sometimes with Biden's visit to Vietnam. But sometimes I guess you have to look at not necessarily doing the ideal thing. I know that, it's a fine line, but during World War II, I mean, we knew Stalin was a bad guy, and, we still sent arms and supplies to them in order to fight the Nazis. Churchill did the same thing. He hated Stalin, but again, the same thing. So I'm just kind of wondering if that can be a little bit of an analogy to where we are today and what maybe Biden is trying to do, obviously in a much smaller way.
Yeah, I mean, look, when you have, Hitler taking over half of Europe, I mean, that's a different situation. People didn't describe that as, a fight for democracy. It was really just a fight to
Survival.
Yes. So, but I mean, if you look at some of these decisions Biden has been taking, why did he fly off to Saudi Arabia and do his, classic fist bump with Mohammed bin Salman? It was, what that was really about was trying to convince the Saudis to pump a little bit more oil so that, the price of a tank of gas would be lower with midterm elections approaching. I mean, this is not the survival of the world at stake. This is all very narrow stuff. And Biden looked, silly, principleless. He was completely played by the Saudi crown prince because, he pumped a smidgen more oil and then reversed himself by a whole lot more a month later. And these days is, cutting production in line with Putin, effectively subsidizing Putin's war crimes in Ukraine. And so what did Biden get for this fist bump other than to look like an unprincipled, effort to sort of, secure something, a supplicant from it. So I just, you kind of have to wonder what's going on. Right now he's been pushing Mohammed bin Salman to have a normalization deal with Israel. And that's, I would say that's probably Biden's biggest priority right now in the Middle East. And this is, despite Netanyahu's attacks on Israeli democracy, it's despite the deepening repression in the occupied territory. And is this is this really kind of a principled thing to do? I know Biden sees electoral advantages in doing this, but it actually took Mohammed bin Salman to say, we're not going forward because Netanyahu's too repressive right now. So when MBS is your human rights defender, something's wrong. So I just, I don't know what's happened here. And this is, I think part of it is just, if you talk in terms of the kind of US bureaucracy, I think the State Department is being sidelined right now. Antony Blinken actually is a much deeper believer in human rights. This is the White House running things. Jake Sullivan, who's the National Security Advisor, Brett McCurk, who is the kind of chief advisor in the Middle East. These are people who are skeptical about human rights, don't value them that much, and I think are guiding a lot of this. But it's making Biden look bad. It's making him less effective. This is not a successful foreign policy.
I thank you.
Would you pass the mic to the lady behind you?
Hi, my question is, you mentioned quite early in your talk about the various votes that have been taken in the UN and the Human Rights Group, your Human Rights Group, and you're on paper, and these are, how to put it, they're marks against the country, but they don't do anything, quite frankly. I mean, there's no teeth in it. This is what I don't know what the actual effects of these various votes that seem to, put them as bad actors on the stage. There doesn't seem to be any specific, real hard consequences to that. Everybody's taken votes against what Russia's doing in Ukraine, but we sit back because they're not members of NATO, so we can't help them. I mean, it just seems bizarre in some way that the very things that are supposed to help with stuff don't have teeth in them. And I'm not so sure how terribly embarrassed these other countries are for being labeled as bad actors. But then we had the visits of the president and this, that, and the other thing, going on that literally undermines these votes and labelings that are being taken. I don't know.
I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, it's obviously true that the United Nations doesn't have a police force. It can't go arrest people. I mean, it's when there's a vote condemning someone or setting up an investigation, there's not, a coercive backdrop to that. Even the Security Council, which is the one part of the UN that has coercive power, it doesn't have its own military. It still has to operate through member states. So at that level, what you're saying is true. But I would not diminish the significance of condemnation by the UN. This is, the leading body of the world's nations, so it has a certain stature. And if you look at the behavior of governments, governments are desperate to avoid that condemnation. Even or leading with
Why?
Because if you are an autocrat, you obviously your people are not voting for you. So one way for you to tell your people that I'm an okay leader is by showing that you're accepted as an okay leader by the rest of the world. Because no autocrat wants to rule purely through coercive means. They all depend on a degree of acquiescence. And most people just kind of get on with their day-to-day life and accept the government. And to get that level of acquiescence requires portraying themselves as serving the people. If you get the UN condemning you as one of the worst, that undermines the ability to claim that everybody else accepts me, and so therefore you should accept me too. And now it's true that people like Putin now, he's kind of gotten to the desperate point that he's probably beyond shaming, because for him, I think he sees it as a matter of life and death. But so certain people do get into that extreme category. But even Xi Jinping is nowhere close to that. If you just look at how desperate China was to avoid a debate about the UN High Commissioner's report on Xinjiang, this mattered to him. And does it make a difference on the ground? Let me give you one example where it did. In 2017, Human Rights Watch, really led a big fight at the UN Human Rights Council to establish an oversight mechanism for Yemen, where the Saudi-led coalition was bombing over and over civilians. And so it was a big fight. We narrowly won, and then the Saudis ended up agreeing to it. So for 4 years, there was this oversight body that would investigate and report on the Saudi-led coalition's conduct in Yemen. Then in 2021, in the middle of the pandemic, when the council was meeting virtually, so you couldn't just kind of meet with diplomats in the hallways at the Palais des Nations in Geneva, the Saudis, using a combination of bribes and threats, were able to reverse that decision. And so suddenly this oversight mechanism disappeared. And in the next several months, the number of civilian casualties in Yemen doubled. And it showed that you could say, who cares? It's just the UN, just a group of people issuing reports. But the Saudis cared. And it pretty clearly had changed, one, they cared enough to try to get it lifted, but two, it seemed to affect their behavior on the ground. So that's why, yes, there's a certain intangibility to a UN resolution, but this kind of shaming, the stigmatization that comes from condemnation by your peers still matters, even to the vast majority of governmental leaders.
Ken had said scrutiny changes things. When you're under the spotlight, your behavior changes, hopefully for the better.
I think everybody behaves, slightly better when they're watched,
Okay, I have
even
a
governments.
I have a couple of questions that are coming in online,
Okay.
so they're gonna, let me take the first one because it's a little more in sequence of what we've been talking about. I'm more frightened by the large and faithful following that autocratic leaders now have in the US, Israel, and other democracies than I am by Biden's cooperation with autocrats in non-democratic countries. The fact that so many people are willing, enthusiastic to elect autocrats in democratic countries says to me that democracy is not doing well. What is your opinion?
Yeah, I think they're both problems, but I try to address them both in my remarks. In other words, I do think that there's a big domestic problem in that there are significant numbers of people who, because I think they feel left behind, because they feel that they're not served by democracy, are turning on democracy. And they are accelerated in that direction by certain autocratic politicians or autocratically inclined politicians who are attacking the premises of democracy. They're using these exclusionary appeals and attacking the rights of people. They're attacking checks and balances on their power. They're distrusting even elections. And so I do feel that we need to attack those autocratic voices, but we also have to kind of recognize the fertile terrain in which they operate, which is people who, because they feel left behind, disserved by democracy, are turning on democracy. And that's why, I did make a point of saying that, I think that it's not enough to just sort of attack the autocrats. We also have got to ensure that democracy is doing what it's supposed to be doing.
And so what would be the ways that in fact we would shore that up?
Well, as I said, I think it's a matter of, looking at the people who are left behind and seeing, what do they need? And often, what they need is some hope. They need decent jobs. They need decent healthcare. They need decent education. They need to, feel that the world is just not stagnating or getting worse. These are, a lot of these people are concentrated in the middle of the country, where the economy is not doing well. Now, and I think Biden is making an effort in that direction. But I think we have to recognize that it is this sort of, sense of stagnation by many people in the country that are leading them to turn to Trump-like answers. But it's not just, kind of, as I said, it's not just the practical program that's required. I think the Democratic Party has gotten bad at listening to those people, and bad at showing respect for those people, which they need to do if they're going to win them back. I think there's a sort of view that, that part of the country is lost. We're going to just focus on the swing states. And that's, I don't think that's effective. It's because there's such a large part of the country which has become fertile ground for the autocratic appeal.
But in many cases also, the federal aid has been rejected by some of these countries, these
Yeah.
states. So
Well,
that
yeah.
things that might actually improve them, the people aren't necessarily supportive of.
Yeah, well, what some governors have done, and I think it's outrageous, is rejected the expansion of federal health insurance that is gonna be 90% paid by the federal government, because that's Obamacare. And just as a matter of principle, they're gonna reject it. So, and what that means is that, the poorest people in their states don't have health care, which they otherwise would have been entitled to. I think they make that calculation because I think they feel that the people who are denied health care are gonna vote Democratic. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But if you look at sort of, what are the government services that their supporters benefit from, they're not attacking Social Security. They're not attacking Medicare. They actually are perfectly willing to take in most of these government benefits. It really was Obamacare, which they, viewed as a democratic victory, that they were rejecting, even though it was hurting, a segment of their own population. But these were, Republican governors in these states. I don't think we can say this is what the people of those states wanted necessarily.
But they elected them.
They elected them, yes. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have a question over here, Don.
This morning when I was listening to public radio, they were talking about the new owner of Twitter and the fact that he believes in what he calls free speech. And according to the program this morning, this has allowed a great outpouring of X views against blacks and against Jews. And so one begins to think that perhaps the new owner has some other ideas than just free speech. Now, free speech of this kind is limited in other countries. For example, in Canada, you cannot deny the Holocaust occurred. And in Germany, you have to be careful if you say things about the Nazis and the Nazi Party. So my question really comes down to looking at, should there be a limit in America on what you call free speech? And so that's the question I have is, if these other countries believe that free speech should be limited in these ways, then perhaps America should think this through as well.
Yeah, I mean, the US is, the First Amendment is much more free speech oriented than virtually any other constitutional provision around the world. And, one way to understand it, there's a kind of this classic Supreme Court case, Renberg versus Ohio, which articulated this distinction between incitement of violence that can be suppressed, but mere advocacy of violence which cannot. Which the easiest way to understand that is basically, if I say, go attack that person and there's no opportunity to rebut, it's sort of like, putting a spark on the gasoline, then that can be suppressed because you can't meet my speech with speech. But if, it's a different context and I can advocate violence, but somebody else can say, no, that doesn't make sense, then that's protected. You let the debate argue that out. Now, I don't see that changing as a constitutional matter, but in terms of the rules for Twitter or now X, that's, the First Amendment doesn't control that. This is a private company. And these companies, have to varying degrees made commitments to try to restrict hate speech. Elon Musk is seemingly less inclined to do that. Much of the debate is about what should be taken down. And I actually think that is missing what is the major factor here, which is what is promoted. The algorithms really are much more important than what is taken down. Because if you, put some, hateful comment up there, but it just dies, it doesn't matter. But if you put a hateful comment up there and the algorithm makes sure that, thousands of people see it, that matters much more. And virtually all these social media companies have algorithms that prioritize engagement because engagement is profitable. The more eyeballs, the more ads they can sell, the more money they make. And much of this hateful speech is engaging. And so if the algorithms were adjusted so that they didn't promote hateful speech, they didn't necessarily have to take it down, they just didn't promote it, that would go a long way towards solving this problem. But much of the conversation these days focuses on takedowns rather than the algorithms.
But I see you in a way saying that there should be limits to free speech if these algorithms are given the power to do exactly that.
Well, again, as a technical matter, the First Amendment doesn't apply to a private company. It applies to government.
That's a different issue.
Yeah. So, but do I think that the private companies should be under pressure to, not necessarily governmental pressure, but public pressure to adjust the algorithms? Yes, I've exerted pressure on them myself.
Thank you.
Okay, I have another question. We go back to zombies. Although you say that the US is not a zombie democracy, and that might be true of the country as a whole, don't you fear that some of the smaller governing units within the country are nearing or trying to achieve zombie democracy status? For example, the Wisconsin State House, which Republicans control, is weighing ousting Justice Janet Prostaskiewicz even before she hears a single case, so as to prevent a change in control of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Isn't gerrymandering a form of zombieism?
Yeah. No, I think these are examples of trying to, undermine democracy and undermine the checks and balances that make democracy work. So, if through a fair process you get a state Supreme Court that is, different, inclined politically in a way that's different from the legislature, and the legislature then tries to undercut the power of the court, that is undermining the checks and balances of democracy. Absolutely. Gerrymandering is an attempt to prevent the people of a jurisdiction from being able to elect, their representatives in a fair way. And it's basically, trying to stick all of the opposition tending voters into one little area so they can't control things. And so these are all efforts to undermine a fair electoral system, absolutely. It has when I use the term zombieism, I'm referring to something even more extreme. But these are all, very definitely attacks on what should be, kind of an effective democracy.
It's yours.
Yeah.
If you were to put yourself in China and you were representing the views from China, and you look at the major democracies, and perhaps the United States is the best example, when you have two parties that are led by dictators because there are no other candidates, and you say, well, the majority of the people don't want either one. And is democracy failing in the United States when the majority of the people are not represented?
Wait, so who are the two dictators?
Trump and Biden.
I guess I wouldn't characterize them.
Well, I'm asking you to put yourself in China with a view.
Well, no, look, what the Chinese government does, and the Russians do this much more so, but the Chinese are moving in this direction, is that they love to highlight the divisiveness of democracy. So, whenever there's a big political struggle or whenever there's a kind of a congressional stalemate or, they love to spotlight that. And their argument is, us autocrats, we deliver, we get things done. And that's the classic, China model appeal. Now, if you start looking at what they get done, they actually get their country into trouble. And we've seen that now, whether, as I open up, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Xi Jinping's COVID policies, Xi Jinping's economic policies. So that is the standard argument. You're too messy over there in those democracies. You're just not getting, you're paralyzed. We need a strong man to get stuff done. But I think that argument is looking pretty pathetic these days.
I guess I would disagree in the sense that you're taking the point of view from sitting here. If you were sitting
Yeah.
there and looking at what we call democracy, and you see two pillars of leading parties that are not representing the views of the public.
Yeah, but look, I mean, first of all, the last thing a Chinese government leader is gonna do is to start criticizing leaders for not representing the views of the public, because Xi Jinping doesn't even let the public express its views, so, let alone vote. So that's not an argument he's gonna make. But, I mean, this is, we all know the various reasons why the US has a two-party system, it's a primary system. In Trump's case, the fact that he, has 35% loyalty among the populace, sort of a majority probably among the Republican Party, he wins the primaries, and it's, and I'm, it may be unfortunate, but that's the system. Biden similarly, I mean, there people may prefer that he not run, but they're not voting for somebody else, there's been no surge of support for somebody else. So, and at this stage, I think if Biden runs, he will win all the primaries and he'll be the candidate. Now, is this an ideal situation to rerun Biden versus Trump? I mean, you can make a lot of arguments against that. But there, are fair procedural processes that lead to that conclusion.
And importantly, people aren't voting in the primaries. So we get what we get.
That's a heck of a solution to
Not happy.
what is the majority of the people feel misrepresented.
And in part, they're bringing it on themselves. All right, I'm having a cranky morning. Okay. A question closer to home.
They're bringing it on themselves.
Yeah. When you have the mic, so let me let you go first.
Well, no, you go first.
All right, we're gonna, okay. When you or members of your team at Human Rights Watch go into a troubled country, how do you protect yourselves?
Well, I mean, it's something we take very seriously. We obviously don't run around with bodyguards, not that would do any good, We have a security director whose job it is to really have conversations with a researcher before they go into a difficult situation.
Mm-hmm.
And, first of all, make an assessment whether they can go or not.
Yeah.
But second, if they are gonna go, to take precautions. And that, if you're in a war zone, for example, the precautions are typically, communicating with people, is there fighting in this area, or can I get through? Are there roadblocks I've got to worry about? You ask who are you gonna travel with? Are you gonna travel somebody who, is gonna be kind of good at a checkpoint and help you get through? Are you communicating regularly? So there are steps that can be taken. If it's too dangerous, we don't go there. We'll talk to somebody who was there. Because Human Rights Watch's methodology doesn't necessarily require us to be at the scene of the crime. We can talk to somebody who was there.
Right.
And sometimes if it's just too difficult to get there, people will come to us.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing we're relying on more and more these days is this remote monitoring capacity. If amazing, if something significant happens, it's become almost second nature for people to take a photograph or video and post it on social media. And so you can scrape that social media and, collect all of this visual information, which you then have to verify because it could be concocted. But you test it against testimony, you test it against, one visual against another. You test it against satellite imagery because you know that the satellite imagery is true. And Human Rights Watch has a partnership with this group called Planet, which is a company based in San Francisco that sends up these micro satellites and they take a picture of the entire world every single day. So you can call them up and say, we'd like to have, this particular location on these 3 dates, and they'll send it to you. And so, you can verify a lot. So these are tools you use, and if we don't know for sure, we don't publish.
Mm-hmm.
But we do take the security of our staff very seriously.
I'm sure.
I've got a question.
Wait, I think we have one here and then
Okay.
let's go to you and then I think that might be the last question.
You know, I find the discussion with freedom of speech very interesting. And many years ago, I was a member of something at Yale called the Committee for Freedom of Expression at Yale. It was headed by C. Vann Woodward, became quite well known. And one of the things that we realized as we studied that was that people who had written about freedom of speech kind of felt that it had to be fairly absolute. I mean, there's this expression, freedom for speech that we hate. Now, that's kind of somewhat gone by the wayside, but we also have another problem today. And another problem today is a change in technology, in that the internet has allowed anyone to be a publisher. And that seems to me to be sort of a problem, that anyone can be a publisher. And I was interested in, what do you think about this issue of how much limit do you think there needs to be on freedom of speech? And what about the internet? Does the internet create a problem?
Now, the internet is actually, as you say, is a big game changer because, it used to be, obviously anybody could stand on the soapbox and say whatever they wanted. But if you were going to, get your views disseminated, you needed to attract some media outlet to publish your views. And therefore you had to contend with editors. And they, would be a type of filter. And so there obviously you get horrible media outlets too, but it was that need to work through these intermediaries did tend to constrain some of the most extreme speech. And today, theoretically anybody can post anything on social media. Now, one interesting thing is that, if you were an editor, you had to worry about defamation laws. You were liable for things you published, which automatically imposed a certain constraint on you. The social media platforms say, no, we're not editors. We're just the phone company. You don't sue the phone company for something defamatory that's said on the phone line. They're just, a utility. But in fact, if you look at the social media platforms, when you introduce the algorithms look more like an editor than they do like the phone company. And should the social media companies be able to hide behind this sort of phone company defense against liability, when in fact they are playing an editorial role, a very profitable one, through their algorithms? And they're trying to avoid tooth and nail having that question asked. But I think it's a very important one. It may be one way to constrain some of this efforts to disseminate the most hateful speech.
Tyler.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick question. We've talked about the more egregious autocracies out there. What we haven't talked about are some countries kind of on the periphery that we don't talk about too much. In Africa, for example, we've had a number of coups recently, as you know, in Niger and Gabon. Those weren't the first. And you look at those countries, and not only are they pretty horrifically bad in terms of human rights, but they also have an underlying theme of corruption virtually throughout. And I wonder, does your organization look at corruption as being one of the many causes of the failure of human rights to emerge in those countries?
Yeah, corruption plays a role in a number of respects, as you're alluding to.
Yeah.
It is a reason for people to get disillusioned with their government.
Yeah.
It is a reason for leaders to cling to power because it's very lucrative.
Sure.
It also, kind of leads to bad decision making because you start deciding, what's going to deepen your bank account more than what's good for the people. And the antidote to corruption is really greater accountability, which means, more transparency, freedom of the media, civil society activists and the like, rule of law. So these are all, ways in which human rights intersect with corruption, which we are quite concerned about.
I have one question more, and I guess because we didn't talk about it, let me throw it out, and I think you're going to have to answer I think this could be a very detailed question, but could you discuss the different approaches to solve the migration issue, short-term and long-term, by autocracies versus democracies?
Yeah, well,
You got motels set up?
yeah, I mean, look, the autocrats love to use migration as a way of, it's like migrants are the perfect people to demonize because they don't vote, and it's a way to kind of, rally a group of people, if you're some of the left behinds and the economy's not working in your neighborhood, blame the migrants, whether or not it's true, but it's kind of just an easy scapegoat. And so, it's very, very common for autocrats to attack migrants. I mean, that's certainly, a big part of the Republican Party these days in Trump's appeal. It's what Orban does. It's what, PiS, the Polish party, ruling party does. Giorgia Meloni in Italy. So this is kind of a very common thread. Italy's interesting right now because Italy is suffering from a severe labor shortage. And even Meloni now is recognizing that they need more immigration. So how do you square that? And I think, if you look at, what about immigration sets off the right wing? It tends to be visions of kind of so-called uncontrolled migration at the border. So, people who are just, showing up in large numbers. What doesn't really spark it is people who come in legally. You could be giving out large numbers of student visas or work permits or tourist visas. When people just show up legally, even if they overstay their visa, it doesn't spark anywhere near the same outrage. It is the stuff at the borders, which leads people to feel, my border, it's out of control, my country's being invaded. And so I think, there are lessons to draw from that. One is, I think, to recognize that virtually every Western country right now, the main places where migrants want to go, they need migration for economic purposes. Everybody has an aging society. If we're going to maintain the same economic vibrancy, we need more migration. How do you do that in a way that avoids a backlash? You increase things like work visas or student visas so people can come in legally. With respect to, asylum, the US system right now, or the European for that matter, is crazy because, everybody should be entitled to apply for asylum if you're fleeing persecution, if you're fleeing war. The idea that it's going to take 6 years to determine your asylum claim is ridiculous. And so they should be investing in quicker, fair determinations and then sending people back if they can't demonstrate an asylum claim. That's kind of an obvious solution to a big part of the problem. But, in the US Congress, they can't even agree on that because they can't agree on anything around migration. But the other thing is that, and Europe is more at fault for this than the United States, but there are elements in the United States too of kind of building the wall and forcing people into the desert where it's dangerous. In Europe, they just force people to cross the sea, and they're using drowning as a deterrent strategy. But there is, if there's recognition that there's a need for legal migration, it would be in everybody's interest if you established, kind of more safe avenues for migration, which would be orderly, it wouldn't generate the same kind of political pushback, and it wouldn't require people to risk their lives to get into the country that actually needs them.
We hope that people are listening to what you have to say. Anyway.
You want to tell us about your next book?
Sure.
I was not prompted by Ken to ask this question.
It's my first book, so we shouldn't just say next book. It's but I've actually finished the manuscript. I'm in the editing process now, but it's called Righting Wrongs, and it's about sort of how we put pressure on governments to respect rights, and it's sort of filled with stories from my 30 years of experience running the organization. And so it is, it has a memoirish quality, but it really is explaining how we got stuff done. There'll be kind of an insider's view on that. So it's being published by Kenneth. It probably won't be out for another year because these things take a long time, but it's moving along.
Well, if we ordered in a lot of pizza, Ken should continue to tell us about how they righted all those wrongs. Thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure.
Absolutely.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you, yeah.
It was, lots of things to think about, and I guess we'll be hopeful also that much of what you say will in fact come to. We're just a little impatient.